Kate Finley, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Hope College in Michigan, and I'm a visiting faculty fellow at the center. I mostly work on topics in philosophy of cognitive science, especially philosophy of psychiatry, and more recently bioethics. And a central focus of a lot of my research broadly is how our conceptual frameworks, so models, narratives, metaphors, sometimes don't just represent or result from our scientific theorizing, but also shape the theorizing itself, as well as the underlying, in this case, mental phenomena. So in my main project here, I'm looking at concepts of mechanism and mechanistic explanation in psychiatry. So these notions are pretty ubiquitous in psychiatric research and practice, and they of course have their origins in machine metaphors and analogies. Recently, notions of minimal mechanism have emerged that define mechanism more minimally, deliberately to avoid some of the more machine-related associations. And there's been uptake of this in some psychiatric work, but I think both in some of these instances where one is invoking these more minimal, thinner notions, as well as instances where mechanism is invoked in a much more ambiguous and imprecise way, both of these can sometimes generate a kind of, or different kinds of explanatory gaps or vacuums, especially moving from causal accounts to certain kinds of models and explanations. And I think these gaps can kind of let back in some of these problematic machine metaphor associations. So reductionism, determinism, certain understandings of function. So I want to dig into that. And I think there are lots of interesting things about psychiatry in particular that make some of these effects even more amplified. And I also think we can see some indication of the downstream effects of some of the things I'm talking about in psychiatric research. So looking at a lot of the discourse surrounding the RDoC, the research domain criteria. I think also when we look at work on decision-making in psychiatrists, and then also work on patient or client self-understanding. So people experiencing mental disorder. There's really interesting research showing that endorsement of biogenetic, often mechanistic accounts of mental disorder is associated with patients' decreased sense of self-efficacy and increased prognostic pessimism, what's termed mechanistic dehumanization, as well as in my own work, I've found associations with decreased meaning making. There are also some positive effects. So one is a decreased sense of blame for one's mental disorder. But I think here we're seeing some of these downstream effects of what I'm focusing on. And I think one way to understand this is by understanding machine metaphors functioning as conceptual, not merely linguistic devices, in which we're often understanding target concepts, in this case, a particular symptom or cognitive process, by mapping it onto more familiar and often concrete what are called source concepts. In this case, it would be machines, their processes, traits. So ultimately, I want to analyze the impact of these things in shaping certain kinds of modeling and explanation in psychiatry, as well as exploring ways to counteract some of these more negative effects while retaining minimal mechanism notions, especially in some of this downstream kind of in practice ways of using them in psychiatric practice. And I'm interested in doing this in ways that are helpful for psychiatrists and other mental health professionals, as well as those experiencing mental disorder themselves. And so this work was motivated by and kind of draws on some previous research of mine. Just briefly mention, I've previously written on the role of computational metaphors in debates about theories of cognition, so kind of exploring something structurally similar. And then I've also conducted multiple studies using long-form interviews and questionnaires with people who have experienced severe mental disorder. One interesting finding I mentioned above was this association between endorsement of biogenetic causes with reduced meaning making, which is really important because meaning making plays such a central role in our ability to deal with various kinds of suffering. I've also written on kind of how we should understand non-dysfunction-centered accounts of mental disorder, specifically what are called pride or strategy accounts, and the restrictive impact of dysfunction-centered accounts on theorizing about mental disorder, as well as on the conceptual resources available to those experiencing it themselves. And then lastly, there are a couple empirical studies I'm involved in running that are at various stages while I'm here. So in a few studies, we found correlations between basically endorsement of computational and mechanistic metaphors and increased trust and confidence in one's cognitive faculties, so particularly memory, as well as increased resistance to non-dysfunction-centered models of mental disorder. In another study, we're currently looking at associations between participants' beliefs about their mental and neurological processes, so beliefs about neuroplasticity, their agency over processes, and their participation in a neurofeedback, or what's called a brain training task. So with that study, we're basically asking, or one of the questions we're asking is, what effect might your beliefs about your mind and brain have on various kinds of cognitive processing? And then lastly, we're looking at kind of in relation to what I mentioned above with mechanistic dehumanization. In another study, we've investigated the impact of narratives and specifically their role in perspective taking in countering this kind of effect towards people experiencing psychosis. Specifically by looking at whether inhibiting or exciting a certain region of the brain involved in perspective taking moderates these effects. So it's been really great to work at the center on these projects and my main project that's kind of a culmination of a lot of this previous research and interacting with a lot of colleagues here whose work is connected in interesting ways.